Welcome back to another episode of Out Loud Geek, where we discuss news and views about pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, food, cooking, the outdoors, and more. It's time for the final weekend box office roundup video for 2024. While it's hard to believe that 2024 is nearly over, here we are, and for the weekend that ended on December 29th, only one new movie made it into this weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office. And the cumulative total earnings for the weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office rose slightly up to $133.9 million, which was a 3.9% increase over last weekend's cumulative total of $128.9 million. So it was another very good weekend for domestic movie theaters, which included increased ticket sales during the week thanks to the Christmas holiday. But before proceeding, if you're enjoying this video, please consider pressing the like button, and if you'd like to see more of my content, I hope you'll consider subscribing to my channel. And I want to convey my deepest thanks and appreciation to everyone who has subscribed. This weekend's top 5 movies at the domestic box office included the following. Clinging to number 1 was Paramount Pictures, Sega Sammy Group's original films, Marsa Animation Planets, and Blur Studios' animated prequel entitled Sonic the Hedgehog 3. Clinging to number 2 was Walt Disney Pictures' animated prequel entitled Mufasa the Lion King. Opening at number 3 was Studio 8's Focus Features, Maiden Voyage Films, and Birch Hill Road Entertainment's horror movie entitled Nosferatu. Falling to number 4 was Universal Pictures and Mark Platt Productions' musical fantasy entitled Wicked, starring Cynthia Erivo, Ariana Grande, Jeff Goldblum, and Michelle Yeoh. And falling to number 5 was Walt Disney Animation Studios' sequel entitled Moana 2. And it's ironic that Disney has 2 animated movies competing against each other at the box office. Domestically, Sonic the Hedgehog 3 earned another $38 million during the weekend and $38.8 million during the week, and it earned another $72.6 million internationally and $149.4 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $136.9 million, $74 million, and $210.9 million respectively. And as I had said would happen last week, Sonic the Hedgehog 3 opened in a large number of international markets, which is why it had such a great international box office haul. The movie also benefited from the Christmas holiday. Domestically, Mufasa the Lion King earned another $37.1 million during the weekend and $41 million during the week, and it earned another $127.3 million internationally and $205.4 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $113.5 million, $214.5 million, and $328 million respectively. So domestically, as compared with its opening weekend, Mufasa the Lion King not only managed to earn more during its second weekend at the box office, which is a rare accomplishment in of itself, its total earnings over the entire week were essentially more than double of what it had earned during its opening weekend. Santa Claus was indeed very good to Mufasa the Lion King in terms of increased movie theater ticket sales over the Christmas holiday. Nosferatu opened by earning $40.3 million domestically and $3 million internationally for a global gross opening weekend box office total of $43.3 million. Domestically, Wicked earned another $19.5 million during the weekend and $20.2 million during the week, undoubtedly thanks to Christmas, and it earned another $22.8 million internationally and $62.4 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $424.2 million, $210.1 million, and $634.4 million respectively. So Wicked also benefited from increased Christmas holiday box office, but not to the same extent as Sonic the Hedgehog 3 or Mufasa the Lion King, though it did become only the third movie so far this year to break $400 million domestically as of this past weekend. Domestically, Moana 2 earned another $18.2 million during the weekend and $17.2 million during the week, and it earned another $56.8 million internationally and $92.2 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $394.6 million, $487.9 million, and $882.5 million, respectively. So Christmas was also good to Moana 2, which will be demonstrated by its revised projections later in the video. I'd love to know in the comments below whether you watched any of these 5 movies this weekend and what you thought about them if you did, or whether you weren't interested in seeing any of them. So as of this last weekend of 2024, the 3 highest grossing movies for the year remained Disney Pixar's animated movie Inside Out 2, Disney and Marvel Studios' MCU movie Deadpool and Wolverine, and Universal's Wicked, with domestic box office earnings of $653 million, $636.7 million, and $424.2 million, respectively. So Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine remain the only 2 movies so far this year that have broken $600 million domestically, and Deadpool and Wolverine became the highest grossing R-rated movie of all time domestically. But globally, the 3 highest grossing movies for 2024 remain Inside Out 2, Deadpool and Wolverine, and Illumination Entertainment's animated sequel Despicable Me 4, with earnings of $1,698.6 million, $1,338.1 million, and $969.2 million, respectively. Inside Out 2 outperformed last year's highest-grossing movie Barbie by $253 million, and Deadpool and Wolverine became both the highest-grossing R-rated movie worldwide of all time and the MCU's 6th highest-grossing movie worldwide of all time. Inside Out 2 and Deadpool and Wolverine remain the only 2 movies that have earned more than $1 billion worldwide so far this year, and Despicable Me 4 is only the 3rd movie so far this year that has broken $900 million worldwide, though Moana 2 is poised to break $900 million worldwide by next weekend, which will be the first weekend of 2025. The reported production budgets for Inside Out 2, Deadpool and Wolverine, and Despicable Me 4 are $200 million, $250 million, and $100 million, respectively. And to estimate what their break-even point ranges might be, I'll multiply each movie's production budget by 2.5 and 3.0 respectively to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, as well as the additional costs of marketing the movie and other miscellaneous costs that the studio pays above and beyond the production budget. And when I do that, we get the following estimated break-even point ranges. For Inside Out 2, we get an estimated break-even point range of $500 million to $600 million. For Deadpool and Wolverine, we get an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. And for Despicable Me 4, we get an estimated break-even point range of $250 million to $300 million. Thus, all 3 of these movies have made bank. That brings us to several other movies that I am continuing to track but are no longer in or never were in the top 5, and they include the following. Falling to number 8 was Paramount Pictures, Scott Free Films, Lucy Fisher's, and Douglas Wick's historical drama Gladiator 2, starring Paul Mescal, Denzel Washington, and Pedro Pascal. Falling to number 11 was Columbia Pictures, Sony Pictures, Marvel Entertainment's, and 2 other studios' supervillain movie entitled Kraven the Hunter. Falling to number 12 was New Line Cinema's, Warner Brothers Animation's, Sola Media's, Wingnut Films, and Domain Entertainment's animated fantasy entitled The Lord of the Rings: The War of the Rohirrim. And finally, falling to number 23 was Universal Pictures and DreamWorks Animation's movie entitled The Wild Robot. Domestically, Gladiator 2 earned another $4.2 million during the weekend and $4.9 million during the week, and it earned another $9.8 million internationally and $18.8 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $161.3 million, $272.1 million, and $435.2 million, respectively. Domestically, Kraven the Hunter earned another $1.7 million during the weekend and $2.3 million during the week, and it earned another $5.8 million internationally and $9.8 million globally to bring its current domestic, international, and global gross box office totals up to $21.4 million, $31.2 million, and $52.6 million, respectively. Domestically, The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim earned another $455,000 during the weekend and $799,000 during the week, but it has no new reported international box office earnings this week. So its current domestic box office earnings rose to $8.6 million, its international box office earnings remained unchanged at $7.9 million, but its current global gross box office earnings rose to $16.5 million. Domestically, The Wild Robot earned another $30,000 to bring its current domestic box office total up to $143.2 million. But since it had no additional international earnings, its international box office total remained unchanged at $181.1 million, though its current global gross box office total rose slightly to $324.3 million. Now, to know whether these movies are going to break even or not, as well as how much money they might be losing, we need to estimate their break-even points. When a movie's marketing budget is known, we can add it to the movie's production budget and then multiply the sum by 2. Otherwise, we can multiply the production budget by 2.5 for a single mid-range estimated break-even point, or by both 2.5 and 3.0 for a broader estimated break-even point range. Both methods account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves. For Sonic the Hedgehog 3, with its production budget of around $122 million, as reported by the New York Times, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $305 million to $366 million. For Mufasa the Lion King, with its production budget of $200 million, as reported by multiple sources, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $500 million to $600 million. Since Wicked and Moana 2 have identical reported production budgets of $150 million, each of them has an estimated break-even point range of $375 million to $450 million. For Gladiator 2, with its reported very high production budget of $250 million, as reported by Variety, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million. For Kraven the Hunter, with its reported production budget of $110 million, according to Variety, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $275 million to $330 million. For The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, with its reported production budget of $30 million, as reported by Slash Film, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $75 million to $90 million. For The Wild Robot, with its production budget of $78 million, that yields an estimated break-even point range of $195 million to $234 million. So in this video, I am no longer projecting or never have projected what the final domestic or global gross box office earnings might be for the movies Gladiator 2, The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, or The Wild Robot, because their expected future earnings are either currently too small, possibly non-existent, or going unreported, or their projected earnings aren't much higher than their current earnings. For Gladiator 2, with its reported global gross box office earnings of $416.2 million and its estimated break-even point range of $625 million to $750 million, the movie currently stands to lose somewhere on the order of $208.8 million to $333.8 million in global gross box office revenue. For The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, with its reported global gross box office earnings of $16.5 million and its estimated break-even point range of $75 million to $90 million, the movie currently stands to lose somewhere on the order of $58.5 million to $73.5 million in global gross box office revenue. But The Wild Robot has already made bank. Then, by dividing the losses in global gross box office revenue by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, the affected studios currently stand to lose the following. For Gladiator 2, Paramount Pictures, Scott-Free Films, Lucy Fisher, and Douglas Wick currently stand to lose around $104.4 million to $166.9 million. For The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, New Line Cinema, Warner Brothers Animation, Sola Media, Wingnut Films, and Domain Entertainment currently stand to lose around $29.3 million to $36.8 million. And that now brings us to the movies whose final domestic and global gross box office revenues I am currently projecting, which includes Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Mufasa the Lion King, Wicked, Moana 2, and Kraven the Hunter. For Sonic the Hedgehog 3, using a range of possible average weekly draws from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $252 million at the low end, $279.3 million at the mid-range, and $315.4 million at the upper end, which is much higher than last week's projection thanks to the boost it received during the Christmas holiday. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 64.91%, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $388.2 million at the low end, $430.3 million at the mid-range, and $486 million at the upper end, which is higher than last week's projection. And with the movie's estimated break-even point range of $305 million to $366 million, the likelihood of the movie being able to break even has greatly increased. For Mufasa the Lion King, using a range of possible average weekly draws from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $230.6 million at the low end, $258.3 million at the mid-range, and $295.1 million at the upper end, which is much higher than last week's projection. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 34.6%, which is much higher than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $666.4 million at the low end, $746.6 million at the mid-range, and $852.7 million at the upper end, which is much higher than last week's projection. So instead of seemingly becoming a likely flop as suggested by last week's projections, it would appear that Santa Claus has reversed the fortunes of Mufasa the Lion King by greatly increasing the movie's likelihood of being able to break even. But whether its continued box office earnings will remain sufficiently elevated to sustain this rosier projection is to be seen. If a falloff occurs, then future projections won't necessarily be as good going forward. For Wicked, using a range of possible average weekly drops from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $483.6 million at the low end, $497.5 million at the mid-range, and $515.5 million at the upper end, which is higher than last week's projection, thanks to the boost in revenue that the movie received over Christmas. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 66.87%, which is slightly lower than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $723.2 million at the low end, $743.9 million at the mid-range, and $770.9 million at the upper end, which is much higher than last week's projection thanks again to its Christmas holiday boost. So while Wicked continues to outperform Moana 2 domestically, it still won't be able to catch up to Moana 2's global gross box office earnings because Moana 2 is outperforming Wicked internationally, as illustrated by Wicked's domestic share being around 20% higher than Moana 2's. But Wicked has already made bank. For Moana 2, using a range of possible average weekly drops from 30 to 40%, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $447.7 million at the low end, $460.2 million at the mid-range, and $476.5 million at the upper end, which is higher than last week's projection, but still falls short of the final domestic box office projections for Wicked, as illustrated by the orange and green dashed lines in the chart. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 44.71%, which is slightly lower than last week's, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $1 billion $1.2 million at the low end, $1 billion $29.1 million at the mid-range, and $1 billion $65.6 million at the upper end, which is considerably higher than last week's projection, and once again suggests that the movie may break $1 billion at the worldwide box office, which it may very well do given that it's poised to break $900 million worldwide by next weekend. Interestingly, my very first projections for Moana 2 strongly suggested that the movie could not only potentially break $1 billion at the worldwide box office, but that it might also become the third highest grossing movie worldwide for 2024. Then those possibilities evaporated as subsequent revised projections continually slid downwards, that is, until again, the movie received a strong boost in box office ticket sales during the Christmas holiday. But regardless, Moana 2 has already made bank. For Kraven the Hunter, this is Sony's and Columbia Pictures' 18th Marvel movie, which began with their 1997 Marvel movie entitled Men in Black. Using the first 17 movies' combined average weekly drop of 34.32% with a standard deviation of 9.48%, that creates a range of possible average weekly drops for this movie from 24.84% to 43.80%. And using that range, I can project that the final domestic box office earnings for the movie may range from $26.5 million at the low end, $29 million at the mid-range, and $33.3 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection. And since that entire range is even further below the green dashed line towards the top of the chart, which represents the $43.8 million in final domestic box office revenue earned by Madam Web earlier this year, Kraven the Hunter is far more poised to replace Madam Web as Sony's lowest grossing Marvel movie domestically of all time. Then by using the movie's current domestic share of 40.67%, which is barely lower than last week, I can project that the final global gross box office earnings for the movie may range from $65.2 million at the low end, $71.4 million at the mid-range, and $81.9 million at the upper end, which is more narrow than last week's projection. This revised projected range is also further below the $100.3 million that was earned by Madam Web globally earlier this year, as shown by the green dashed line in the chart, and greatly increases the likelihood that Kraven the Hunter will replace Madam Web as the lowest grossing Sony Marvel movie worldwide of all time. And with the movie's estimated break-even point range of $275 million to $330 million, Kraven the Hunter is a bona fide flop, as it currently stands to lose somewhere on the order of $193.1 million to $264.8 million in global gross box office revenue, which, when divided by 2 to account for the 50% of gross box office ticket sales that movie theaters keep for themselves, means that Columbia Pictures, Sony Pictures, Marvel Entertainment, and 2 other studios currently stand to lose around $96.5 million to $132.4 million. So to recap, Kraven the Hunter, Lord of the Rings: The War of the Rohirrim, and Gladiator 2 are definite flops. But The Wild Robot, Deadpool and Wolverine, Inside Out 2, Despicable Me 4, Moana 2, and Wicked have all made bank, while Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is far more likely to break even, as is Mufasa the Lion King. Please let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video and whether you have or are planning to see any of the movies that I talked about. Thanks for watching today, and a huge thanks to each and every one of you who has subscribed to support this channel. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, and Blue Sky by clicking on the links in the description. Until next time, this is Out Loud Geek.